by 2028, China's as a geopolitical leverage over rare earths will go away.
What powers do they have? Who is paying them? Who ensures that they're in office from next year?
A lot of things in China don't happen because Xi Jinping says so, but there's a lot of competition which happens between local governments.
What is the ideal mix of strategy that I should go in as India?
You can try to do a lot of things at home, but there will still be one choke point which you hadn't thought of, and someone can use that leverage.
If I have to do industrial policy, how do I replicate the guys that got it right?
You have to think of ingredients and not recipes. This is really crucial, right?
We haven't done this podcast for very long, but here's something we're already starting to understand. You bring different guests for different reasons. There are guests that you bring on to understand a very specific subject. And then there are guests that you bring because they've spent years thinking seriously about a whole range of questions, all of which shape the world. We're going to see the latter today. My guest today is Pranay Kotasthane. Pranay is a deputy director at the Takshila Institution, where his work covers everything from public policy to international relations to high-tech geopolitics. Just as important as his research, however, is how he takes the time to make his ideas known. He co-hosts Pulyabazi and co-writes Anticipating the Unintended, both of which come with that mix of being deep and nuanced, yet accessible. One of the first things that you realize about Pranay when you start following him is the sheer range of things that he has an interesting perspective about. He thinks about subjects that don't obviously sit together, but the way he talks about them, they all feel connected. There's a common thread running through them. An interest in systems, institutions, incentives, and the unintended consequences that hide behind the surface of big projects. You're going to see a lot of that in this episode as well. We cover a lot of ground, but we never sacrifice depth, because that is just how Pranay thinks. Welcome to the show.
So Pranay, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here, Pranav. I do keep reading your daily brief, so it's great to be here.
That is extremely flattering to hear. Partly because I have been reading you at least since 2018. So to know the possibility that you're reading is an incredible thing. So I think it was around when I started reading you, this is before COVID, that you started talking about a world that was turning towards something called the Matsya Nyaya, where it was no longer important that countries felt like they had to be seen to be right. That power was all that really mattered. I don't know what I felt back then, but seeing how things have been over the last year, we have most definitely entered into a Matsya Nyaya state of the world. Now, if this is the reality that India has to live in, then how do we look at things? What is the chessboard in front of us? What are the possibilities that we can play for? How likely are all those possibilities?
Right. So, I'll put it this way, that international relations was always Matsya Nyaya. So Matsya Nyaya is a concept in the Arthashastra which really talks about international relations space is an amoral space. So unlike domestic affairs where there is a morality most commonly affirmed by something called a constitution, right? So even the prime minister or the president has to abide by certain rules and procedures which are laid down in the constitution, right? So there's a morality, and we can call it the constitutional morality. International relations is not like that, right? So I think it will be good to start with a framework in this idea that great powers seek not just power, but they seek authority. And authority is a combination of two things, power and legitimacy. Okay. So the way we have to think is, because it's an amoral space, the big powers always have more things that they can do. But that's not their endpoint. They want authority because you don't want to exercise power every time, right? The exercise of power is time consuming, it drains your energy. So you want to also exercise legitimacy. Your exercise of power should be deemed legitimate, like you said, by most other people. And how do you do that? The way you do that is most great powers will create certain kinds of institutions. And those institutions, they will also follow some of the rules of the institutions. It will always be unequal because it's an amoral space. It's not as if US has the same power as Maldives has in the international space. There's definitely a difference, and that's the way it is. Even though we have this construct of Westphalian construct, every nation has sovereignty. There are certain ideas that we have agreed to, but in terms of power, US can do a lot more things, and India can do fewer things, and Maldives can do even fewer things. That's how it is. So in that sense, what great powers were trying to do is build their own institutions and also themselves follow some of these institutional norms so that that power is deemed to be legitimate by others. Legitimacy disarms others and it makes them follow your rules without you having to coerce them explicitly. So that was the world which, after the World War II, we entered a phase where there were two big powers and both of them tried to create their own institutions, tried to follow some of those rules themselves. And we were in that phase. 90s, when USSR collapsed, we entered that unipolar moment where only the US power and legitimacy was high and it was able to do a lot of things. And slowly, starting, I would say, Obama period in the US, already we started a period where US power was still high, but its legitimacy was going down because it was exercising power in ways which were thought to be illegitimate in the eyes of other nation states, right? So it started with botched up Afghanistan invasion. Even before that, in George Bush's time, the Iraq invasion, Afghanistan, finally US had to go back. And then now in this Trump era in the US, it's even more so, right? Because there is an alienation of allies. There is also the exercise of power, which is having huge negative consequences. We are speaking even as the West Asian war is happening. No one knows what the objective of this was. Why is it still continuing? What will it imply for the world? These things, and US itself backed out from many of the institutions that that it upheld, right? So it created a lot of things on the Bretton Woods institutions. It followed it, but now US has quit the climate change accords. It has moved back on many of its commitments. WTO is no longer functional. So that legitimacy part is reduced now, even though power of US is very high, right? So it was able to do things in Venezuela and Iran which no other nation state is able to stop them from doing, but their legitimacy has reduced.
So what specifically can the US not do because it is bleeding legitimacy? Where do the constraints start to bite in?
Yeah. So I think to understand that, we have to see why the US is doing these things. So there, the Chinese angle also comes into being, right? So till the unipolar moment, there was this idea that, we have no other equal, is how the US was thinking. But slowly it was China also. In fact, the US helped China's rise in many ways, getting China into the WTO, a lot of US companies investing in China, and that really led to China doing great things. But slowly we saw that China's power differential with US, at least in US perception, was reducing. And that led it to do many things which I would have said they could have handled it better. But anyways, we are in this phase where US legitimacy is decreasing and there's no other power to fill that vacuum, because even China does not have a great alternative to the US rules-based orders. When people use the word rules-based order, it's not rules-based order in like a normative sense. It's US's rules-based order, you can say. There are rules that applied were the US rules. And now, but there's no China's rules-based order which the world is willing to accept, because China equally has been coercive. Its relationship with its neighbors is not great, and it does not have the kind of power that US has anyways. So we are in that phase which people have termed, like former NSA Shiv Shankar Menon terms it, this is a world disorder, right? So earlier there was some kind of world order, and we are in this transition phase where there is still US as a big power, but China is not yet there to fill its shoes. And there is this transition phase where we are looking towards a change in the world order. It might go in different ways. There might be places where again you have a US-China G2. India hopes it will be a multipolar order where there will be multiple poles. At least that's what the government says. And then there are other ideas. Maybe if the US is able to bounce back, it can again return as a unipolar order. So there are various scenarios that we have tried to map out in our book, India's Marathon also, where there are multiple geopolitical scenarios, there are multiple geoeconomic trends, and you have 20 worlds which can emerge out of it. We've tried to map them. But yeah, we are in that phase. So US, because of the acts that it has done through Trump and even before that, its legitimacy is decreasing. In fact, hypocrisy is very important in international relations. People always argue, is India being hypocritical? Yeah, I mean, in amoral space, every nation state has to be hypocritical. But you have to do hypocrisy in an artful way, right? You should have to be able to do hypocrisy, and yet the other should not be able to allege that you are hypocritical. US was hypocritical, but it was able to still say, we support democracy, and most people believed that they support democracy even though they were supporting the dictators of the world. And we never questioned that, right? We still had this norms are there is democracy is great, there used to be freedom ratings index which people used to closely follow, right? So why was that happening? Because it had this, the greatest form of soft power is normative power, right? You because you're reading US books, you're influenced by what the writings come from them, you also cognitively think in those ways. That normative power no longer exists, right? In this Matsya Nyaya age, it is very clear that they are not able to do hypocrisy artfully. The hypocrisy has been exposed, and that's the real challenge. That
So if I am India in a phase like this, where even if I try to say that I believe in, say, international free trade or democracy or any of that, most people would either not take me seriously or they won't care, because it seems like, at least the people who sort of wanted to establish that way of doing things, they have retreated from the space. So how should I, as India, start seeing the game? Because I don't have the hard power to do the same things as the US is. What can I do?
right. So again, when we talk about Matsya Nyaya, the currency of the international relations is power. So we have to do things which increase our power. That's why democracy, pluralism, free trade, we are not saying this because these are good for the world. We have to do this because they are good for us. They are in our national interest. We know it from our experience when, for example, the world was there was more freer trade. I'll not call it free trade. Freer trade between the period 2004 to 2008, before the global financial crisis. That was the golden period for Indian economy also. We grew 8% year on year. Our income tax collections ballooned. So we know that it works for us, and that's why we want to support it, right? The cheaper imports coming means we can do value addition, export it outside. That's why we want freer trade. So all of this is, from, at least from our point of view, it's not a normative idea that we should ban because it is just something, it is great and US told us so or something. We do this because it is in our interest. Pluralism, absolutely, right? For a big country like India, pluralism is again absolutely necessary. So is democracy and idea. So India's principle has never been that because we are doing things in a way, others should also adopt this, which has been the US idea. The grand strategy of US is very Alexandrian in nature, right? It wants to do this. India has never been so, even when it was a bigger global power in Asia. India is what India. So I think India's biggest value lies in showing that the Indian model can succeed. That itself becomes a big thing that other nation states observe. Other nation states follow your lead not because of what you say, but what you do and what you represent. So if India is a success, if India is doing well in itself, that becomes a lesson for many countries. In fact, like for example, even when India was a much smaller power, but it had big normative value, legitimacy immediately after the Second World War, right? When India was independent, lots of newly independent nation states were looking up to India, how many of the constitutions which were followed from what India was doing as well, right? So in that sense, India's goal should be that we need to become the most successful power using our model as quickly as possible. That is what we want to do. Other nation states, if they find resonance in it, will follow it.
One of the places where Matsya Nyaya is very clearly playing out is the space of critical minerals, right? And you have written quite extensively about critical minerals. But here's the thing. When I started to actually read about critical minerals, I realized that it was such a vast space that I couldn't even begin to sort of imagine how to use this idea intellectually, right? As soon as you start reading about critical minerals, you realize that there is no one thing that is happening. There are actually dozens of stories playing out together. There is a separate critical minerals race for batteries. There's a separate critical minerals race for wires, a separate one for magnets, a separate one for chips. There are hegemons in this space. There are power brokers, there are bit players, there are has-beens. There's a story that is touching everything from salty lakes in Bolivia to sort of sludge-filled toxic areas in Inner Mongolia. There is just an infinity of things that is all happening together, all sort of neatly labeled as critical minerals. I think primarily because different countries have just put a bunch of things in a list. As a scholar that is actually trying to understand this extremely vast space, what are the kind of frameworks that you apply to even understand how to make sense of all this chaos?
So again, I'll try to talk about two frameworks here. One critical idea is, see, this is called weaponization of resources, right? And it's not new. It has happened earlier also, and I'll give you some examples. But the one framework to keep in mind is resource leverage is an exhaustible resource. The more times it's like a card which you play, but its value reduces the moment you play. So now these kinds of restrictions on rare earths, or even forget critical minerals, even on chips, etc. When US plays this card of, I won't give you chips, it immediately makes other nation states realize that, hey, we have to do something on our own or between ourselves because this can happen again. And similarly, China does that on critical minerals. And immediately other nation states know that, we need to get our act together. So there is this idea called creative insecurity, which Mark Taylor talks about in his book called Politics of Innovation. So the idea is that whenever the sum total of external threats is greater than the sum total of internal divisions, nation states tend to spend more on R&D and innovation. So all these things which are happening are fueling creative insecurity. There's an empirical analysis. So that's why, for example, he writes Sweden does a lot more innovative things than Denmark does. Otherwise, Denmark and Sweden are equal on many parameters, GDP per capita, geography broadly, etc. But Sweden faces the Russia threat more than Denmark does. So it faces the creative insecurity more, and it has tended to invest more in R&D and innovation. So that is one angle where resource leverage, the moment China uses this, it is making China plus one happen. So I always say the only country which can make China plus one happen is China, and it is doing it now. That's one lens. The other lens is that prices are wonderful. Prices are really a decentralizing coordination mechanism, and this Alex Tabarrok talks about how prices are a signal wrapped in an incentive, right? So that's what prices are. That's what Hayek wrote about in his wonderful paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society. We didn't need to know about critical minerals till now. Those critical minerals have been part of our lives since the 18th century. Cigarette lighters used to have them, cerium was there and all that. So it's been like 250 years with us or more. But why are we discussing them now? The question is because we are not allowing markets to operate, because we have put these kind of barriers. The way prices work is only they are a coordination mechanism. Only the people who should know of these materials knew it, and we didn't need to know. I mean, people didn't even know what TSMC was or any other company was, because you didn't need to know. We operate in different kinds of abstractions, right? So we didn't need to. We were at the luxury that we didn't need to know which is the metal in my phone. Others who were operating in that industry, only they needed to know, because the prices were the signal that coordinated them. That as price of this increases, I will change, I will probably procure less of it, I will procure something more, I'll find an alternative, all that. Now we have entered, with these two frameworks in mind, we can understand the critical mineral race. Critical minerals largely are non-fuel minerals, which are essential in use, and they are subject to supply risks. This is a Congressional Research Service definition. The supply risks can be geologic, technical, economic, environmental. All these are the risks. So we are not talking about oil and gas, non-fuel, but they are essential in use. So they were used everywhere. As I said, they are there everywhere. And we were fine with it. We didn't even know what they were because they were being coordinated. China became a big supplier of one kind of critical minerals, which are rare earths. Now, rare earths are a group of 17 elements which are not rare in terms of their presence in the crust. The rarest of rare earths are 200 times more found in the Earth's crust than gold, for example. But their discovery, their extraction, refining is difficult, and they are chemically so similar that separating separating them from each other is difficult. So that's why the term rare is generally used. But this was the beginning of this idea that because China became a dominant power in the refining space of rare earths, and we were fine because it was supplying it at a cheap rate to everyone in the world. So fine, even if it is supplying it at a cheap rate, it's very environmentally polluting also for after extraction, which is the mining process, even the refining process where you are increasing the concentrates of these rare earths, you do that generally by acid leaching, which is an environmentally polluting process. So the West was very happy for it to move to China and other places. In all these technologies were invented in the West. They were doing rare earths. Largest producers were America, etc. Until the 50s, 60s. Now it moved to China. China had started doing this cheaply, and because their model is investment led, prone to structural overcapacity, it also meant that it was much cheaper than the market rate that would have placed it at, and it was exported cheaply, just like they are doing for electric vehicles, solar panels, same story. So because it was largely going to other worlds, the world was also okay to accept it. But what that meant is we were foregoing resilience for cheapness of that product, which was good until we hit this period where everything has become weaponized again, right? So now US restricted chips to China. China said, we are also have some cards to play, and we will now restrict these critical minerals to the entire world. It's not just to the US. And that has led to this situation where we are in today.
So it's almost as though if you want to preserve your points of leverage, you have to have legitimacy, which is, goes back to our previous question.
Yeah, for example, now what are other countries doing? That's the interesting bit here, right? First thing we have to think is it really difficult for other countries to make rare earths? It is, but it's not that difficult for you to learn refining because it has been a process which is old. You can do that in other countries also. Do you have mines in other places? As I said, it is abundant. Sure, you might have to increase output of some mines. You might have to even make some new mines, which takes a lot of time. And then there is also the recycling part. That's why oil is different from many of these minerals, right? You can recover lithium from end of life lithium batteries. Lithium doesn't get combusted by its use. Oil obviously is a fuel mineral, right? We derive energy by combusting it. So you can't recover oil from your petrol two-wheeler, but you can recover lithium from your electric two-wheeler, right? So a lot of that can be done in recycling as well. So in that sense, many countries are now have awoken to the fact that China will use this as leverage the next time you have bad relations with China. It is very clear because they have put this as, there's Commerce Ministry has a department now which issues licenses for not just some high-end stuff, okay, even for diamond cutters, wire saws, and a whole lot of things. In fact, if now under the October 2025 rules, they had also said that if a Chinese national is trying to build rare earth capabilities outside China in other countries, they can be jailed, they can be punished. So these are ridiculous restrictions where they have tried to weaponize everything. And whenever you do that, there is creative insecurity. Other countries are trying to find ways in which they can get out. So the most interesting part of this is what I call substitution. It's not as if you can't build without rare earths or critical minerals. Tesla, the two four-wheelers existed, their first kind of motors didn't have rare earth magnets. Why do rare earth magnets are used? Because rare earth magnets are very powerful. You can achieve a lot of power and torque in the motor at a small form factor, right? Because they add, and you can also achieve high temperatures without losing your magnetic power and things like that. That's why permanent magnets are used. But those permanent magnets you can also use induction motors, you can use other kinds of motors where efficiency will be less, but you can find other ways to compensate for that efficiency. So what is now happening is many countries are doing and companies are doing work on substituting rare earths totally. So we know of Indian companies which are saying our next generation of two-wheelers will not use rare earths at all, or the motors they will not use. Or some are using, we can become more efficient. Instead of using milligrams of rare earths, we'll use micrograms and try to get the same efficiency. So all those kinds of things are already in place. Tesla has announced its next generation of cars will be rare earth free. So as I said in the beginning, right, once you use a resource leverage others will start, you might gain brownie points in the first instance that you use it, but others start quickly modifying resources. I'll give you many cool historical examples about this also. So in the 1930s, the dual-use material of the world was natural rubber. Natural rubber was this thing which was used in military applications. It was for tanks, for bullets, for other things, and the tires in the wide economy, etc. But natural rubber, most of it used to come from Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia got occupied during the World War II by Japan, and the West's entire access to this dual-use material stopped. But we didn't have a rubber crisis. Why? Because there was something called synthetic rubber, which already existed since 1908. The technique was invented in Germany, but no one was bothered about it because this natural rubber is coming cheaply from Southeast Asia. Why even bother? But because of this geopolitics related issue, then synthetic rubber technology was quickly productized, which already existed. And by the end of the Second World War, we had really put synthetic rubber as substitute for rubber in quick time, and it happened. The COVID-19 vaccine was another example, right? Within that period, people were able to find alternatives, have a vaccine developed, sidestep many of the regulations which would have taken 5 years, condense them to 1 year and get the vaccine out. Those are the kinds of things that happen, and China is making that happen. 1950s, mercury was a critical mineral. It was used in walkie-talkies during the Korean War. China again restricted that, and people thought, we'll not get access to this. How will we build walkie-talkies? But it was built, substitutes were built. During the 1980s, cobalt even now is highly concentrated in Congo, the DRC, and it was occupied during that time by some rebels. They were close to USSR, so there was again this term called a materials myopia, which was used by a US congressman, that we don't look at materials, whereas the USSR is looking at materials. We have to do something. And eventually the solution that came up was, we didn't hear of just like oil has had these cartels, there have been many attempts to build a copper cartel, there have been attempts to build a cartel for cobalt and others, but none of them have worked because they are different. So what happened during this cobalt myopia also, bunch of things happened. Nation states could build stockpiles. You can't build huge stockpiles of oil beyond a particular period, but you can build stockpiles of many of these critical minerals which are required in smaller quantities. So nations built stockpiles. Second, for cobalt was heavily used in jet engine superalloys. And then people started saying, oh, can we use molybdenum as a substitute? Again, people knew that it could be used, but no one was bothered about using it because cobalt was available abundantly. But when that happened, molybdenum got productized, carbon fibers got productized. So over time, we found other alternatives, and then new mines opened up in places like Canada, Australia, which were somewhat substitute. So you don't need to reduce 100% reliance on China, but China should know that there are alternatives. And once you have 30-40% capacity built in other places and the demand reducing through substitutes, then the leverage reduces. So my conclusion or claim is that by 2028, China's as a geopolitical leverage over rare earths will go away, because I'm seeing a lot of interesting things happening in other countries, companies, and including in India, and it will not be the kind of thing that it is used. So this is an optimistic take. Most people think that China's leverage over rare earths is so strong that we will not be able to overcome it. But I say you don't need to reduce 0%. You just need to be able to have alternates and substitutes, which I think are on the horizon.
So if I'm, say, India looking at this situation, right, there are two things that are open to me. So one, if I look at how, for instance, China managed to make its stranglehold over rare earths, I might think that this is a time to do a lot of industrial policy. This is a time to sort of send IREL to start production, or, basically incentivize like capturing all of the nodes that I can as soon as possible through various subsidies or whatever. The other way I can think of dealing with this situation is to just say that, listen, let's just hold off. I think markets can find a way to sort of go around them. In some cases, that's already working out. Like you mentioned, a lot of Indian auto manufacturers are finding ways to make magnets without rare earths. What is the ideal mix of strategy that I should go in as India?
Again, the framework I would apply to this is think of comparative advantage, right? So other countries are doing many things. US is going very heavily on industrial policy now in this space, right? The Department of War has had equity stake in a MP Materials rare earths making company. They are not just doing equity, they are also having an offtake agreement with that company that even if your prices are higher than the Chinese rare earth suppliers, we will buy it from you for 10 years at a fixed price. So there are price guarantees, offtake guarantees, all price floor mechanisms, all of this US is doing. And this is just one example. They are also giving a lot of funding equity for other companies which want to build rare earth magnets. Many countries are doing that. Some of it India also has to do. But what are our comparative advantages? I would start from there. Our comparative advantage would be in two segments. One segment is that we do have a large resource of rare earth which are found in our monazite sands. And the constraint there is not so much industrial policy, it is regulations. Because our monazite sands have rare earths and they are also coterminous with thorium. And thorium is important for India's 3-stage nuclear cycle. So because of that, no private company can take these rare earths out from it. Only IREL, Indian Rare Earths Limited, which is under the Department of Atomic Energy, is mandated with that. I think we don't need to have that restriction anymore because rare earths are really important, and you can have mandates like whatever thorium you get, you need to return it to a stockpile of which will be used by IREL. That's fine, but why we should open these things for our private companies, get the energy in because the prices are rising, right? Again, I go back to prices. A lot of things in rare earths was not happening because of the prices were so low. The prices were never high of this, right? Like total rare earth imports of the US last year were around $186 million. That's less than what the avocados that US bought last year, right? So, I mean, if the prices are so low, why would anyone do it? But now because of China's restrictions, the prices are rising, which means private companies would want to do this. And sand extracting this will be quicker. It won't take the kind of 10, 15 years like it is required for deep mining. And it will also be environmentally less polluting. If you can identify specific areas and do this, you don't have to do deep mining and all that. You can quickly build a feedstock within 2-3 years time. So that's one segment for rare earths. There are also other things like gallium, etc. are found coterminous with alumina. We do have a lot of aluminium which is extracted, but no one was doing gallium extraction because again, why do you do that when you can buy it cheaply? But now because China has also put restrictions on gallium germanium, prices are rising. So can we again enable private companies to do that? That's one segment. The other segment where I think industrial policy is required is in exploration. Exploration is different from mining. Mining, first you do prospecting, you try to determine whether actually you have the mineral in high concentration in a particular area or not, right? Once that is done, mining starts. So exploration essentially solves a market failure called information asymmetry, right? Because no miner is going to put 10 years of their money and effort if they don't know that I am 100% sure that there is a huge resource which is available here at this particular concentration and all that. That's what exploration does. Now, exploration generally in the world is on a first come, first serve basis. So you can apply for exploration. Within a few days, you can get approval. You do the exploration and then you give a report and then you can see whether someone wants to mine or not. In India, it is done using auctions. And what essentially it means is that auctions are heavily political instrument. They take a lot of time, and eventually many of our blocks don't even reach the stage where mining can begin because exploration hasn't happened. So
We're betting money almost for an outcome that you have no idea about. And
that's why no one bets on it. So no, our mining doesn't start. So an example I always give is, I don't know if you heard 2-3 years ago, there was this idea that India found a lot of lithium reserves in Riyasi district of Jammu and Kashmir, right?
Right.
And we thought, our lithium problem is solved. As of now, that block has not even been sold. Because when it was found, someone had to do the exploration, prospecting, and finally conclude that this much resource exists at this, and whether it is economical to extract it, all that has to be done at the exploration stage. That has not been done. So I think there's industrial policy case for government should give money for explorers. It should be done in a first come first serve basis, so that you can quickly conclude that yes, there are standards which determine if this particular reserve is high value or low value. This is what is determined after exploration. So you should be able to do that quickly, determine it, and if the government is solving a market failure of information asymmetry, I'm okay if they put money for it. So government does have exploration licenses, etc., but it's still not to the extent that we can quicken it. So this is a comparative advantage we should be thinking of. The third element is recycling. A lot of, we've written about urban mining of rare earths, because we have a huge market which is going to have a lot of electronic components which are reaching their end of life. As our electric vehicles reach end of lives, we'll also have even a bigger source for rare earths, for lithium, etc. Right? So in fact, we should be importing some of these things, because then we can extract rare earths and lithium from it, because this is again environmentally less polluting, and we will have bigger feedstock because we are a big market. So we should actually be thinking a lot more on that segment. Can we stimulate the recycling space? We have some EPR mandates which make companies also look at the end of life cycle, but those EPRs don't prioritize critical minerals right now. So I would say that is the focus area. If we think of regulations which allow and incentivize EPR's mandates to extract rare earths, to extract lithium, we can quickly do things there. Within 2-3 years, we can have a secondary stream. Again, it won't solve all your problem, but you don't have to. If you have a valid alternative, you can solve things. The third element, which is not in the comparative advantage space, but diplomacy is involved. At no point of time we will be able to have all the critical minerals we need. It's like playing a whack-a-mole game, right? You will solve this. Today we are seeing oil and gas again, there is an issue, right? Tomorrow you will solve the problem of scandium, yttrium will be important. Yttrium, others will be important. So the way you have to think is, can we think of diplomatic arrangements with friendly nations so that you can have joint stockpiles? Some of these materials are required at very small quantities. Okay, so terbium or things like they are not required in huge quantities. So you can build national stockpiles when the prices go low from China. Build stockpiles there. I would advocate industrial policy makes sense. Just like we have strategic petroleum reserves, it's okay to have a strategic mineral reserve, or you better still have a joint reserve. Like you don't need only India to do this, right? Maybe a quad reserve, maybe a reserve with Japan or other places where you can build a stockpile, and depending on your contribution, you can empty it also depending on the money you have put in. You can find mechanisms for it. So I would say we need to think of joint stockpiles. We can also think of offtake guarantees within this bubble. So you don't, just like US is doing with respect to MP material, it's a very inefficient strategy because you're dependent on only one company. But maybe you can do this across countries. So if India already has gallium reserves, which then no, it's not necessary for a US company also to do a gallium reserve, right? Can US companies have offtake mechanism with an Indian company? Or can India have something with the Japanese company? Those kinds of things are required. So we will need diplomatic arrangements also to tackle this space. You can't become Atmanirbhar in this space. You will have to think of the Atma Shakti perspective, right? Where is your power? Build your leverage so that others don't try to coerce you. And then you can do things with your friends as well.
So I want to move a little bit now to manufacturing. I think manufacturing is one of our personal sort of obsessions at the Daily Brief and Markets. And we have sort of read enormous numbers of papers on like what is holding back India's manufacturing. Here's how we are beginning to look at it, right? there's one way of talking about the problems with Indian manufacturing where you just start listing out that, oh, Indian manufacturing is over-regulated. We have labor issues. We don't have clear land titles. Electricity is cross-subsidized, so on and so forth. And then you can have a long laundry list of problems that we need to solve. And naturally, all of them are problems that need to be solved. But solving so much is a multi-decade sort of project. Right? Now, imagine I am just, say, a secretary in some heavy industries department or something. And I think that at this moment, I do not have either the will or the political capital to build this sort of wide consensus and change everything. But I have seen some successes. So I have seen India successfully, for instance, create a smartphone manufacturing ecosystem. And it has had its own agglomeration effects and lots of things have come around. And that seems to work for me. Or I have seen India in just a few years build like the beginnings of a semiconductor assembly and testing cluster. And that is the kind of thing that I want to replicate. My political masters have already bought to the idea that we should do industrial policy. But now I want to answer the question, if I have to do industrial policy, how do I replicate the guys that got it right? What is it that we can learn from those experiences?
Okay. So the lens, again, a framework to look at it is from the framework of complexity. Okay, complexity analysis means that many of these are complex adaptive systems. They are no non-linear. They are non-linear. There is no one action and direct result which will be very linearly followed. The system is, there are many emergent things can happen in a system, right? So that's a complex adaptive system which is very popular in biology, evolutionary biology, etc. I think we have to look at public policy also as a complex adaptive system. Bangalore traffic is a complex adaptive system, right? It can have non-linear effects. One vehicle stopping can have non-linear effects on outer ring road, right? It's not a linear effect. So similarly, there are second order, third order, fourth order effects. Even in manufacturing, if you have to look at it, you have to approach it from the lens of complex adaptive system, which means, I mean, a conventional way of thinking would be that see what East Asia has done, learn from them, best practices approach applied to India or some other place. That is not what works in a complex adaptive system, right? Because there are many other connections, many nodes are connected in different ways. So a great policy which works in South Korea might not work in India because the initial conditions might just be very different. For example, South Korea always had a small market. So they were always focused that if you want to do manufacturing, the only way you do manufacturing is through exports. You can't succeed without that. And once you are only exporting, that's your focus, you automatically bring competitiveness because you are competing with the world. Right? You can give a lot of subsidies to your companies, but finally you are measured by how globally competitive you are. So already you have this discipline which is brought in through exports. We don't have, unfortunately, that, because big countries will always face that problem, because we can always say just close the foreign players and we have a reasonably okay domestic market which is growing, and hence we can just serve that market. Why do we have to look at export, right? So the initial conditions are so different that the policy mechanisms will be very different. So what South Korea does, we can't follow. So the way I think of it is, you have to think of ingredients and not recipes. So you can't borrow the recipes from South Korea, but you can try to see what were the ingredients which existed in South Korea's policies so that emergence can happen and you can have a new recipe in India. So the ingredients, unfortunately, are all the things that you mentioned. It is a complex process, right? And you need to have better trade policies, better tax policies, better labor reforms, low electricity prices. All these we know are the ingredients which, if put together, you can have interesting things and emergent things possible. So I don't necessarily think of it from a sectoral approach that, we have to identify this sector and let's see what can happen in this. You just put together these ingredients in place, and our entrepreneurs are good enough to find what are new things that can happen. An example of this in recent times is actually non-leather footwear. For example, Tamil Nadu has become very quickly a player in this segment. Now, the ingredients for that are, you require cheap labor, you require reasonably good electricity, some capital equipment, etc. There was a government angle in it that essentially non-leather footwear, very interestingly, is manufactured much like semiconductors are manufactured. That it is a lot of it is contracted out. So Nike doesn't manufacture your shoes or other companies. They contract it out to a Taiwanese firm, just like in semiconductors. So Taiwanese companies, names of which you haven't heard, I have forgotten them. Just like TSMC outside our semiconductor world, no one cared about it. So you have some contract manufacturers in Taiwan who used to manufacture these, and Tamil Nadu was able to get many of those contract manufacturers to set up their bases in Tamil Nadu now. So a lot of these Nike, Crocs, etc. are now also manufactured in smaller towns in India, right? So that is because you also had these ingredients in place, reasonably priced electricity, good infrastructure and all that. Now, once you start with that premise, things have improved in India on many of these, right? Infrastructure is better than what it was earlier because you're connected with the global supply chain, right? You will have to import some things, add value, export. So infrastructure was a bottleneck. Infrastructure has improved. With GST, earlier every company would have had to have their go downs in every state because we were not one market, right? That was a ridiculous way where people even to sometimes to export from Tamil Nadu to a port in Kerala, they used to go through Colombo because it was cheaper to do that. Literally, these are instances which we had problems with. Now with GST, even though the tax rates are still higher, but that problem has gone away. You don't have huge trucks waiting on the border checkposts and things like that. So we've improved there. Some form of tax rationalization has happened. So we've improved there. Electricity prices are still high. We've not solved our discom problem. So that ingredient is missing from our repertoire that we can use. So we still need to do those things. So I would say that finally, in fact, in 2004, we had a National Manufacturing Competitiveness Council, which was formed under the Manmohan Singh government, headed by V. Krishnamurthy, who set up Maruti in India. So that report already has the kind of things we need to do. That report we need to go back to and see what were the constraints. Some of those constraints we have already removed. But other than that, there are many constraints which are still remaining. Labor is again a constraint which is remaining. Land policy is still a problem. We have to solve them. Unfortunately, there is no shortcut. We can see semiconductor assembly, etc. We are able to get some things done. Finally, you will need huge labor-intensive manufacturing to have. Those industries are important for strategic reasons, not for labor-intensive manufacturing. For that, we will need to fix these constraints. I am hopeful this deregulation commission idea, which is already putting some of these places, are really important. The labor law, the new 4 labor codes is important. We've not yet done what we wanted to do in that, but we are in that right direction. We have to keep accelerating that. I can give you examples. Even in semiconductors, for instance, there are no Taiwanese assembly firms which have come in, right? Whereas Taiwan is a very big player in that segment. Why? Now, 2 reasons which they have said is labor law reforms. Most of the Taiwanese firms operate on 2 12-hour shifts. India always has 3 8-hour shifts. For profit margins or for assembly generally are wafer thin. So they say we can't operate with 3, we will have a lot of people to employ extra. We can't employ that because we are used to this. Now, none of our states allow for 12-hour shifts. So if you want to have that industry from Taiwan, you might have to at least give that option, right? We don't need to do that. Let the workers decide. That option should exist. Let the state decide. So one state might take a chance. UP might take a chance where there's no employment opportunities. People have to go outside. Let them take a chance. Maybe Tamil Nadu doesn't want to do this or Karnataka doesn't want to do. It's fine. But right now, none of our states are allowing that. So this is a binding constraint which we have to solve. So yeah, industrial policy PLIs, etc. are one way we've found, but PLI is a band-aid, not a solution. We are still not solving. PLI might work in one area where we already have some comparative advantage, so you are just giving it a boost. But as we have seen from the PLI experience, there were 14, 15 PLIs, only 1 or 2 are showing positive results. For others, you need to solve the binding constraints. So deregulation, electricity reforms, labor law reforms, land policy, this is really crucial, right? China succeeded because again they had 3 basic ingredients which they put in place. One, education. There is a nice paper on this by Nitin Bharti and others which looked at 100 years from 1900 to 2000 education trajectory in China. In fact, before communism also, China put in a lot of investment into human capital since the 1920s, whereas we had good universities but not a basic education system. So by the time China opened in 1978, they already had a workforce which was able to quickly learn things, adapt things at the lowest end, right? So education policy. Second, bureaucratic decentralization. A lot of things in China don't happen because Xi Jinping says so. Xi Jinping only says, but there's a lot of competition which happens between local governments. So China is more decentralized than we are, even though it's an authoritarian regime. So that is crucial. And the third thing they did is land policy. Land, again, now we don't have to adopt the Chinese recipe, but we need to know that the ingredient they had was that it was easy for companies to acquire land. And right now, land is a really big constraint in India. You have huge sort of issues in acquiring land. That's why land acquisition policy is supposed to actually be an exception, right? A company should go and be able to buy land from a person, right? Land acquisition policy is supposed to be an exception, but it's become the rule. For all the projects that you mentioned, the government has to acquire land now and provide it to the company, which is, our land markets are completely broken. And why will a company invest that when you have these kinds of constraints that you need to get the government to acquire land and give it to you, right? So that is one thing we still need to fix. And China was able to do that through other means because they can coerce people and get these things done. But land becomes a very big constraint in this. So now there are ideas, people have talked about it, but we need to solve them if we want to see a consistent increase in manufacturing as a percentage of GDP up to 25%, which was the goal of the National Manufacturing Competitiveness Council.
So, Pranay, like, one of the problems that we have run into, right, is that when you look at the failure cases, you have all of these lists of answers. But when you look at what worked, it seems like the answers weren't actually in policy as much as they were in political elbow grease. So when, for instance, Foxconn actually, comes in, the things that make it successful are to manage lots of sort of competing groups. The kind of things that almost hold Apple manufacturing in India back are things like the worker hostels not being good or the bathrooms not being clean, etc. And there is a huge furor over that, and you have to go and manage things like very specific, mundane things like that. So if you're embarking on this project of bringing lots of global industry to India, how much of it happens at these high 40,000 feet levels, and how much of that process happens on the ground solving problems like ensuring that worker housing is adequate?
I don't think so, because I think a lot of the Foxconn example, I mean, we have to compare with what was the Foxconn situation in China or Zhejiang, where it has the biggest manufacturing facility. When they started, you have to compare when their starting point and India's starting point. India's starting point is much better in terms of our worker quality, in terms of the freedoms the workers have, etc. Okay, so is government thing required here? No. I mean, if Foxconn sees it's in their interest, they will build it. Again, they will face constraints on land acquisition or others. If we are able to solve them, they will build it for their own interest, right? So in that sense, I think these things get reported a lot more, that they are the barriers. But I mean, how can you explain the causality? I'm not so sure that these reports get the causality right. That is Foxconn not doing this because of a worker hostel not being there? I don't think so. I mean, worker hostel can be built. Is the binding constraint that they were not getting land for the worker hostel? Then yes, we have to look at that, right?
What I meant rather was that there is a lot of solving of mundane problems on the ground, that you can get your policy package right, but you still need a guy on the ground who's going and talking to people and saying, "Are bhaiya, jaane do, let whatever XYZ happen." I was just wondering, is there a last mile of sorts of like government service delivery that we really need to perfect in order to get a lot of manufacturing in?
I mean, there are last mile things to do. A lot of this deregulation part also will change. They'll only happen if last mile things change, right? For example, how labor inspectors work. You have to be able to change that for things to happen, right? So all of them will have a touch points at the lowest end, but the kinds of things that governments have to do at the lowest end will also be on the have to be things about deregulation, ease of doing business, and how they translate on the ground, rather than building now of big facilities or big hostels. They can be specific if the companies can build those on their own, if we are able to support them. That's what I would say.
Fair. uh, so I want to now shift to artificial intelligence and really understand what India should do, how India should think about this very weird era that we're entering, right? And when I look at the space, right, I see two very different kinds of narratives emerge. So on the one hand, you have this notion that a lot of the dynamism in our economy came from our service exports, and a lot of that was doing simple, replicable work for rich clients. Now, AI has come in at exactly that note. It has eaten exactly that advantage, and that should spell disaster for India service exports. Very difficult questions are being asked of companies like Infosys or TCS. Oh, how are you doing it? Oh, how are you rethinking your models, etc. And it isn't clear that they have like perfect answers just yet, right? So that is a very scary story that you hear. And then there is a more optimistic story that you hear if you just drive down to HSR or Kormangla, where there are lots and lots of people who are sitting on random coffee tables and asking questions like, okay, listen, if I can sell the service for $60 and my API token cost is $35, then I can make a business. I don't have to be as rich as Sam Altman. Right? And I can also imagine that there are thousands of Indians who are doing this, who will become successful and sort of create a different kind of world. What I do not know, however, is if I'm looking sort of 10, 20 years into the future, which of these stories sort of succeeds? Is it the pessimistic story of my advantage being frittered away, or is it the optimistic story of a lot of people creating new kinds of ventures? How do you see this juncture?
Right. It's an interesting thing to debate on. What I think, to start off with, I am not so worried about the software services companies, because I mean, they should be worried, but I am not worried from an Indian national interest public policy point of view, because that's an industry where India actually has not done any protectionism, and those companies have survived on the basis of their own capabilities. Oh, and they have seen many transitions. They have been able to withstand the Y2K crisis, then there was the GFC, there were many other humps that came in, but they managed, they adjusted, etc. So I think they will find a way out. There is a problem because you can't have just their model of pricing people based on the employees that you are providing or contractors. That might not work in this era. So they have to figure out a different model, alternative, and use AI before their customers can use. I think I'm reasonably confident that some companies will go down, some companies will learn it, and some companies, like you said, there will be new HSR based, new Infosys of the AI era, which will also come in and do more interesting things, right? So that will happen. I'm not so worried from a national point of view for this sector. What I'm looking at is, if we think of AI as a general purpose technology, right, there are various narratives people have used. Some people think of this as nuclear weapons. Like people have been pushing in the West that some of this is a nuclear weapon. So I should get it first and then I should deny it to others. Some of them look at it as an innovation race. Some others look at it as an arms race. And some look at it as a general purpose technology. I think we should look at it as a general purpose technology, just like electricity and others. And if you look at that frame, then you have to see what happened in the past technological revolutions. And there's an excellent paper by Mike Mazar, it's for a think tank called RAND. And the paper actually argues that success in the AI era is a societal challenge and not a technological one. I think that framing really resonates with me because you have to think of how you can use from all the past technological revolutions as well. Innovation first happens in some other country, but the country which is able to deploy this in useful, interesting ways, always the one which leads. For example, new chemical revolution happened in Germany. A lot of the processes we used to learn in chemistry all have German names, but it was implemented and diffused in the US because US established the chemical engineering departments first, and the productization of an invention happened in US a lot more, and it was able to take the lead. This comes from Jeffrey Dink's great book on how great technological revolutions, etc. So if we take this frame, we need to think of how can it be deployed and how can we prepare our society to make use of this in the best way, because it will take time. Just like electricity diffusion took 100 years, right? Finally, this will not take 100 years, but is our society prepared for this, right? So from this framing, I think Mike Mazar has 7 factors based on past technological revolutions to determine which countries succeed in a technological transition era. And so I'll go through those 7. I've written it down. The ones he identifies are: 1, national ambition and will; second, unified national identity; third, is there a shared opportunity of using this technology; fourth, is there an active and engaged society; fifth, do we have effective government institutions; sixth, a learning and adaptive intellectual climate; and seventh, diversity and pluralism. So these are factors based on a historical analysis of technological revolutions which determine whether certain countries use this technology and become the bigger powers in it. So do they become the US in the electricity and chemical revolution era, or do they become like the Ottoman Empire, which eventually declines, right? So technology always creates new powers, but what creates new power is societal factors, not so much whether you have access to certain elements. That's why I don't focus so much on whether we have access to chips or that model, or I mean, sure, we will. The models are now available to many countries. DeepSeek, after the DeepSeek idea, and chips also. Today we are talking about Nvidia. You will have alternatives. You will have local models. You will have other architectures. GPU is just an architecture which worked for parallel processing, but there will be newer architectures. There will be more efficient models which will not require the kind of capability. So one focus is on the immediate resources. Do I have models? Do I have chips? That is a focus area. Government should think of it, but we should think on those 7 factors, right, broadly.
Could you make those 7 factors a little more intuitive for us? What exactly is the kind of thing that they're harking to? How did it work in the past? How did societal factors actually beat out, just hard innovation?
Yeah. So national ambition and will. For example, after the Cold War era, USSR competition was very acute. There was, most of the times people felt USSR will be the one which will outpace because it was a more directed, centrally coordinated things, and people like central coordination planning, that they are making 5-year plans, US is not, and it will go ahead. There was a Sputnik moment where people could see the satellite from their naked eyes in US, and it really led to creative insecurity in the US as well, right? But there was a national ambition and will, more so in the US. They were able to put together this National Science Foundation, new NASA, ARPA, which became DARPA. There was Vannevar Bush's report which came in. All of those signal that there is a national ambition and will where we want to get ahead in the world. In today's example, India now has this idea of the Viksit Bharat national ambition and will, right? What it is, whether it will work or not, is a different question. But the fact that we have articulated a national ambition will, which can be measured, right? Becoming developed country with whatever $11,500 per capita is a measurable national ambition and will. It is a good side, right? So that is required as an ambition. Once that is a focus area, we try to align things towards that goal. right? So that is one. The other thing is unified national identity. That is still a problem in India. We still fall into different buckets. We are not able to often come together. Whatever the end required is to get some things done, we'll never be able to get that end together, right? So that still remains problem for us. Then if you look at shared opportunity, that as a factor can reasonably work in India because of how people are seeing UPI or other benefits of it going to many people, not just the the richest society. So in that way, even if the users of AI are able to help people across socio-economic groups, then it benefits. Then there is a shared opportunity sense that this is not just being done for the richest people, but for everyone. And that's why some of the things that India is doing have language models which are on Indian languages, multimodal, multilingual, are useful because they can convey this shared opportunity sense to a broader number of people, right? Effective government institutions are our weak link. We still have government institutions which are not set up for technological revolution. So if we have to change, we have to focus on that, right? So it becomes a governance challenge. I can give 5 things to do and we'll acquire chips, acquire, a computing strategy. These are things which government is already doing, so I don't want to focus on them. But these are the things which are important. Adaptive learning and adaptive intellectual climate. Then again, we have to change our education policies, right? Can we get out of the credentialism mindset to actually enable people to adopt some of these tools? That's where governments have to focus on, is what I would say. So this is my policy mindset. If I have to look at a geopolitics mindset, then I would again go to the frame in the near term era. Are there domains under AI where we have a comparative advantage and we can occupy one segment of the supply chain and do that really well, instead of focusing that we need to have everything from data centers to models? Sure, we need to have, and some companies will already do. But as a government priority, if we have to place, what should we do? There, I would again say, what are our strengths? Our strengths are in software, firmware. So, for example, Python is a layer where a lot of Indian contributors have built in. So, can we think of an open source strategy first, where the dominance of NVIDIA exists because there is a CUDA dominance which it has, right? So because CUDA libraries, etc., work best with NVIDIA chips and not with AMD chips or other GPUs, that's the real moat that NVIDIA has. Now, because we already have some capability in one layer up in Python, can we think of actually having even financing open source communities which are building alternatives to CUDA, right? Alternatives, models, essentially firmware which works with many chips. So whether you have AMD GPU, whether NVIDIA or a TPU, it will just work just as well because you have a translatory layer above. So can that be our focus? Can we have more inference level chips? Can we focus on that? And these can be open source, right? Just like you have a RISC-V alternative for ARM, can you have a RISC-V alternative for low-end inferences as well? These are the things which I think we can do because we have a talent in design, we have a talent in software. And if I had to focus, I would prioritize these over others.
So one thing that I did not think about until maybe 2 weeks ago was technological sovereignty. Because it sounded like a very far off thing until I started actually reading about Palantir and Claude and all of what the US can do today. And now I don't know what to think. I mean, there are these deep learning models that have thousands of data sets that are sort of enmeshed on each other until the computer itself can identify specific people, specific cars, things like that. You have a Claude added on top of that, so you can actually talk to all of those data streams, gather like ridiculous amounts of intelligence together. You can create systems that can take out heads of states on the first attack of a war. And if I'm India and I'm looking at that, I am probably at least a little bit afraid that if this is the frontier of technological capability, and we are already seeing it being deployed at such a large scale, what do I do to also have this capability? What does having my own models matter in this era?
I think the way to look at this would be, what does technological sovereignty mean? Right? There are different versions of this idea itself. Technological sovereignty could mean a full Atmanirbhar autarkic vision, right? That I need to have everything in the AI stack with me. That could be one vision. The other vision could be, I just need to have some base level capabilities across the value chain. And so that, for example, in nuclear weapons, are we technologically sovereign in nuclear weapons? We still import some uranium, but we have the base capabilities, and we don't have as many nukes as Russia has or US has or China has. But we have enough nuclear weapons to convey to people that there will be a mutually assured destruction which can apply. So don't mess with us, right? So you space similarly, right? We don't have the world's best space program, but we know we have certain capabilities, and we have the ASAT test which was done that we can take things down if you act funny with us, right? So that is the second vision. Can you have base capabilities across the value chain? Third vision would be, an innovation vision. Do we have the ingredients to innovate regardless of what happens? And that's how many in Europe see that sovereignty is actually about R&D innovation. Can we put things together such that you are able to just have those ingredients in place, and people will figure out what's the next thing after these LLMs, and then they'll build that instead of chasing the previous game. And the fourth vision of sovereignty would be asymmetric advantage. You might have some capabilities across, but is there some segment in which you have so much dominance that others would not want to mess with you because they know that you can use that leverage? So without using the leverage, you are able to communicate your power just because you are so dominant in it. So these are four different visions of technological sovereignty. I think it's very difficult for any country to be the autarkic vision in this era as well. US will still be dependent on talent from outside. China will be dependent on chips from outside or ASML machines from outside. So no one is fully technologically sovereign. And as we are seeing, it's a whack-a-mole game, right? You can try to do a lot of things at home, but there will still be one choke point which you hadn't thought of, and someone can use that leverage, right? So that will still be the reality. So in that sense, if I am India, given my starting point where we are actually thinking of many of these things right now, and we have to build many of them, I would again look at it from the fourth vision, that can we, from a geopolitical point of view, have expertise in certain segments where the world is so dependent on us that they don't mess with us, right? So what would those capabilities would be? Maybe since we have 20% of the chip design talent here, can we quickly convert that into the more the companies are here, actually that's great, right? If foreign companies are here, they know that they can't quickly move out tomorrow. Even if they want to, they won't find the numbers of talented people in India, that density they won't find in other countries. So they are automatically tied to you in one way, right? For defense related applications, sovereignty matters a lot more. So for defense, we will need to have our own models, we will need to have our own compute, and I think the defense will be able to assemble that together. But from a broader economic sense, broader economy, we will need to think of where can we have that asymmetric leverage, and government role is maybe then also have base capabilities in some segments, right? So you don't, that's why I think having one fab is important. It won't make you Atmanirbhar, no chance. It will, when it is full capacity also, it won't meet even 10% of your 28 nanometer chips demand. But you have that base capability that you have the talent, you have the supply chains to build something 20 years from now, right? So in that sense, some base capability is useful. It is industrial policy, right? But all fabs in the world have been built with some government support or the other. So one fab is good. 10 fabs do we need? No. But in that sense, you build base capability in certain segments, and others you actually think of where can I get leverage quickly and invest there.
I think finally, what I wanted to talk about was the city that we're in. Right? It is one of the great cities of South Asia. It is a beautiful mix of like culture, of incredible weather, of science and technology talent, a lot of things that are mixing together. It's really one of the most sort of dynamic cities in this part of the world at the very least. It is also a very angry city. It is a city where everyone feels neglected. You feel neglected on the roads, you feel neglected on the footpaths, you feel neglected when you see the bridges. You see this constant feeling that the city is sort of being broken down, right? And so many people have different answers for this question. So some people might say that, oh, there are outsiders that have taken up the city and they don't care about the well-being of the city. There are people who think the population is just too much for the city to sustain. There are people who think the problem is corruption. The one thing that I really loved about Takshila's work on sort of urban governance is that you actually started asking the question, okay, who is supposed to run this city? What powers do they have? Who is paying them? Who ensures that they're in office from next year? So I think, could you help us understand what is happening in Bangalore and how do you solve a problem like Bangalore? Like using the kinds of frameworks that you have.
So before coming to the framework, there are many misconceptions about this. So let us unpack that. Is Bangalore overpopulated? The question is absolutely no. Okay, because there's nothing called overpopulation. Okay, Nitin Pai, who is the co-founder of Takshila, he always says it pithily that the problem is under governance, not overpopulation. Right. So I mean, Bangalore can extend in all directions that it wants to. So there's no shortage of land or anything. In fact, there are lots of stats on this. If we put together all top 20 cities in India, the area that they occupy is less than 1% of India. We have enough land. Okay, so there's no overpopulation as such. There is under governance. New York, 1800s, London during the Industrial Revolution grew much faster than Bangalore grew. Right, and they were constrained by their geography also, and yet they are some of the great cities of the world. Right, there's no underpopulation. We are the people, and we have to insist on getting better governance instead of saying people are the problem. It's very easy for the government to say you are the problem. There are too many of you, so I can't provide for you. That's, I mean, if we are a democracy, it's such a ridiculous statement to say, right? So you have to get the governance right. Not the people are not at mistake. People always will come to areas where there is opportunity. So that's one misconception that we have. Second misconception, and I refer to this while talking about China. China works because India doesn't compete with China. India competes with its 300 plus cities. And their 3 cities are a mayor or a party representative in a Chinese city has much more powers than a mayor in Indian city, much more. There is stats to prove that 51% of Chinese government expenditure, 51% happens below provinces. Okay, and in India that number is 3%. So we are not decentralized. I mean, we say we are federal in that sense, but we are not decentralized. Federalism and decentralization are two different things, and we are not truly decentralized in that sense. So we have to now start thinking about, one, Bangalore will always attract more people. Across the world, high-tech centers are always clustered. There are only few clusters. Even in the US, the world's biggest economy, there's only one Silicon Valley, right? The biology industry is also concentrated in Boston. There are no 3 Bostons, 5 Silicon Valleys. They have also tried to have 5 Silicon Valleys, but they can't, even though San Francisco is many times a shitty place, but still things are around Silicon Valley, right? So clustering always happens because that employers exist because employees exist here, employees exist because employers exist here. It's a virtuous cycle which develops. So we have to understand high-tech centers across the world will be highly concentrated. So this idea that let us create 5 Bengalurus in Karnataka, it won't work. We need to find out what Belgavi is good at and get things there. But if you want to have IT companies going to Mangaluru or others, that won't happen. We have tried that, right? It hasn't worked. So you have to actually look at what their strengths are and enable them to do those things. So now coming to Bangalore, right? With this, the framework I would look at is, again, decentralization. There are 3 dimensions to it: political, administrative, and fiscal. Now, political, we have problems with all 3 levels, but political and administrative, we've tried to solve it. Political, half-heartedly through the 73rd, 74th Amendment, where what the government finally said is that state governments can devolve certain powers to local governments. That was what the compact was. And state governments are the incumbents here. They don't want cities to be as powerful. So some states didn't even devolve a tax raising power to the local governments, right? So there are a whole lot of responsibilities for the local governments, but no money raising powers. So how does that kind of a government work where you are always dependent on anything you do at the higher level of government, right? And we don't have functional mayors, which is very ironical because all our major leaders of the freedom struggle were all mayors of their cities, right? Jawaharlal Nehru was mayor of Allahabad. Subhash Chandra Bose had a long career in Kolkata civil government before coming here. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. Many of these leaders had strong local presence. They emerged from their cities. Today, do we know the mayors of our cities? All our cities are run by IAS officers who are just administrators. We don't know our councillors because our councils don't meet. So really the problem is that we have a political problem. Administrative, we've fixed somewhat where we have administrators, but there we would actually need a metropolitan service or something of that nature, right? City governance is a very complex issue. You can't just have anyone who can become a city administrator. So we need a cadre there. But the biggest problem in all this is the fiscal angle. When we did the 73rd, 74th amendment, for rural governance, we actually did it better, but urban governance, we did it even worse. So rural governments now actually have more financial powers than our local urban governments have. In our city itself, roughly 10,000 crore is the budget size thereabouts. 50% of that comes as grants from the state government. How can you plan anything when 50% of you're literally dependent on what the government's view will be higher up, right? So there's a very nice statement the economist Raja Chelliah had said that everyone wants decentralization, but only up to their own level. No one wants decentralization below that. That's where our cities are stuck because our state governments won't give them the powers, won't give them the fiscal powers also. So what you actually need is and with the GST, another thing which has happened is city governments don't even have revenue raising powers which existed earlier, right? You actually need a compact where if there is an 18% GST, it is 882. So 8 for CGST, 8 for SGST and 2% for LGST or local government. So you don't increase the GST rate, but you need a fixed definite sum of money which is coming to the city so that it can plan for itself, right? Then we'll start thinking that, yes, we know we can plan 5 years ahead. This will be how our fiscal situation would be. Can we take up long-term projects then? That is not things which are happening. So that's where we are stuck at. The amount of civil society engagement in Bangalore is amazing, right? The last 15-20 years, we've seen a lot of philanthropy going in, a lot of activism going in, and yet some of that activism is also going in. So that's great, right? We have best institutions coming in outside the government. But some of that in activism is also going into substituting the government. It thinks that we can substitute the government. But you can't substitute the government, right? You will finally have to complement the government. So we need to put our energy in making our government and our city government more competent. For example, on Church Street is the best street in Bangalore. We are officers there, so we obviously love it. And earlier there was this idea that its management will, under the Tender Shore project, it was offloaded to agency outside the government. In fact, the maintenance, etc., was given away to people outside BBMP. It worked well. It was like a substitution, worked well. But then when that contract ended, we had huge amount of rubble, etc., on Church Street because the government said, it's not my problem. It's someone else I had allocated. So now it's finally been resolved. That's what I mean. You have to complement the government, not substitute it. We need to make BBMP more competent, or GBA now. We need to make BDA more competent. We need to make all the agencies which exist more competent rather than saying that you don't do the work, we'll do it for you. And that's where a lot of things go wrong, and the government is happy to offload things to you because they are literally in a problem. They don't have the capability, and it then becomes someone else's problem.
Thanks a lot. I wanted to ask some sort of less questions that are less about the world and more about just how you think about things. I think the reason that we did this episode with you, right, was that you have a lot of very interesting ideas about a very wide array of things. I think at the Daily Brief and at the markets, we're also trying to develop interests in that fashion where, we're trying to understand very, very large parts of the world. And I think the problem that we are constantly running into is that you can understand a very significant chunk of a big problem, and the few things that you don't understand might make your conclusions entirely wrong, right? So we are almost never sure if we've actually nailed the problem or if we're just being overconfident about our way of looking at it. How do you resolve that in your head, given that you're looking at so many very different things?
Yeah. No, that is a very good question, because again, there's an arrogance of ignorance. If you are ignorant, you can be arrogant. But once you know many things, you know the limits of your knowledge as well, right? So the more you know that you don't have the answers, and there are certain factors that you have not considered. So in that sense, I think it's you just be humble, right? You are just able to say that to the extent that I know, this is my view. If I get new data and new ways, I will update my priors, right? So it is Bayesian updation of your thoughts, rather than taking a stance that this is correct and I will stay for it. So, for example, I have put a view that China's geopolitical leverage on rare earths will go away by 2028. If that doesn't happen, I will update my priors and say that I was wrong. Maybe I didn't consider a fact somewhere, but it requires you to still say that, based on my analysis, this is how I think, these are the various lenses I have brought forth to this problem, and based on that knowledge, I am putting forth a view. You get views from others, you try to see if you have to update your Bayesian priors based on that, and if not, then you stick with it, and when the data changes, you change or the empirical on-ground situation changes, you try to update. That's how I would put it. But I think it's a great skill in public policy to actually have a lot of breadth, because it's a complex adaptive system. You need to have, at least there are some core disciplines that you need to have a good understanding of, some key frameworks from there, right? You need to understand key frameworks of international relations, for example, that how different it is from domestic affairs. There are different frameworks which operate here. You can't apply Arthashastra to domestic affairs. There's no Matsya Nyaya here, right? But many people try to apply those kinds of things. So you need to have that cognitive dissonance also, in that sense that there are different areas, different ideas and frames apply to different ideas. And I would say public finance is one such field, social psychology is one such field, then public policy itself, how governments work is one such field. So we need to arm ourselves with some key frameworks from all these, and then when you have a problem, you try to bring all these things together, right? Knowledge generation happens at the intersection of fields, not in one field. So if you just look at it from a sociological lens, you'll never be able to get the entire frame, but you need to bring frames from different streams. So that's how I approach it, knowing fully well that it will never be complete. But yeah, you don't need to be 100% complete. You can always update your view, right? I think Ambedkar had quoted Emerson saying that consistency is the virtue of an ass, and I don't want to be one of them. So yeah, that's how I would put it.
The second thing I want to ask you, right? So one of the reasons that we have been doing everything that we've been doing, or at least the reason that we started, we're now doing it because it's just fun. But the reason we started was that we did not actually know what to read to access depth about what is currently at least happening in India. You would eventually have one good book that explained one thing that happened 10 years ago, but very rarely would you find intelligent commentary on what is currently happening. Now, I think one of the sources that we look at is a lot of what you write, right? You're constantly thinking about, like, very deeply about very high level problems that are currently going on in the world. And for that, I'm sure you have some kind of information diet where you're actually capturing all of those ideas. So what does your information diet look like?
Yeah. So I still follow the old RSS feed readers. So Feedbin is one important source for me. So I'm subscribed to many newsletters and things on Feedbin. I try to check it every day once, and I have made tags, like there's a morning brief one which is only news items, then there is a deep bench which is on deeper studies, and then there are subject specific Google alerts which I have subscribed to on RSS for semiconductor, geopolitics or others. So that's how I try to follow. In the AI world, it might be even better, but I'm still trying to improve my flow in the AI age. But this is my flow as of now. And then books are really important now because I do a podcast as well. I have to read books. That commits me to reading books because you can't be a fool in front of a guest, right? You need to know the book to be able to ask good questions. So that commits me to reading long form works. Because we are a think tank, we are writing long form works, we have to read long form works. So essentially it is all about you put yourself in that situation where you will have to get some of these things done. Newsletters, like you know much better than me because you're doing this on a daily basis, because you have to get it out, you have to focus and you can't let yourself wander too much. And writing is a form of thinking, not reading, right? Reading, if you start from the point that you have to read, you will go in many places, which is good, but writing will make you think in a focused manner and read in with an objective in mind. So writing really helps. Newsletter and a frequency helps. So that gets me to read books. And being at Takshashila, I get to interact with people from so many different disciplines, from people from the armed forces, people retired from the armed forces, people from your world of lawyers, people from different disciplines who are together. So you are always exposed to new ideas, new knowledge. That's how I pick it up. I also try to have a good note-taking habit. So generally, I use Obsidian and have a huge source of whatever interesting I find. The notes could even be just one line or one idea, but I try to build on that. That becomes my input to my writing, right? When I'm writing, I go back to my notes, see if this week was there any interesting thought that I had captured, and then I try to build on top of that. So that's currently my information diet. Newspapers, one newspaper a day, quickly go through that. And podcasts are a big source of my information diet. Because we are in Bangalore, I have a huge, almost a 2-hour commute overall in a day. And I am a big podcast consumer. So I have a very strong list and I listen to them daily. And they have been really helpful for me to build my knowledge base.
Thank you so much for being here, Pranay. It was an absolutely lovely conversation.
Thanks, Pranav. All the best for the daily brief and all the cool things you're up to.